Just like everyone else on the internet, I love cheesy old cyberpunk junk. There's nothing more fun than riffing on outdated images of the future, and when those images are set closer to the present, that means you don't have to wait as long to do it. You get to giggle at all the things they got right and all the things they got wrong. You can safely judge their scattershot predictions, their visions of a future set in the present that uses technology of the past. That stuff has aged in a really fun way. And that's where System Shock comes in, as the awkward and outdated first installment before a bunch of sequels that ended up getting all the attention instead. But what's funny is that it might have seemed more awkward and outdated in the past than in the present. It made so many predictions about future trends in gaming, but was incredibly underexposed for its influence to really be felt. And that's surprising, because everyone loves System Shock 2. GameSpot called it one of the greatest games of all time. It sold under 60,000 copies, but it hooked a crazy cult fanbase who swear it's the best game ever, and they are still making mods for it right now. System Shock 2 made BioShock happen, which is like one of the highest rated PC games of all time, so why does no one ever talk about the first game that set this crazy train in motion? To be honest, it's probably the control scheme. Back in 1994, using arrow keys, spacebar, and control was usually your default FPS control scheme, and System Shock was actually one of the first to default to a WSAD-style layout, which could have made it great. Well, it really uses SXZC, but it's the same general idea of putting 4 basic movement keys off to the left where they can be surrounded by other useful keys. But for some reason, System Shock doesn't let you use any kind of mouse look, even though it wasn't exactly an uncommon feature at the time. Instead, it passes off a whole lot of those functions onto the keyboard. You can press A and D or click and drag the edges of the screen to look left or right, and neither method is really precise or fast enough to feel comfortable. In fact, turning around is such a long, drawn-out process that one upgrade gives you eyes on the back of your head to save yourself the trouble. Meanwhile, Q and E are for leaning, and what's cool is that they let you interrupt and hold the lean, but that means they also wanted to throw in W in there as a button for resetting your lean. R, F, and V control vertical aim, T, G, and B control height, number keys activate upgrades, and function keys activate HUD panels, and before you know it, literally half of the entire keyboard is gone. There are no hotkeys left to speed up some of the most frequent functions you'll be using. I don't get it. You can do without the stance reset buttons, and 5 of the other movement and looking keys could have just been mapped to one mouse, which may be too much to ask for since a ton of stuff already is mapped to the mouse. System Shock inherited the point-and-click FPS interface from Ultima Underworld, where you click and drag items between your own inventory and the game world outside of it. You also do a lot of clicking on the HUD itself to reload weapons, sort your inventory around, or fiddle with the map. And what's ironic is that this maximalist control scheme that streamlines nothing actually does convey fear and stress in a tactile, hands-on way. It's just not elegant enough to make it feel worth the effort. It's like a mouse-based version of what Resident Evil's tank controls intend to do, but unlike those, you could never fit System Shock onto a gamepad. It is both too complicated to compress and too complicated to be intuitive. It also might be worth mentioning that unlike Ultima Underworld and the future Shock games, System Shock 1 isn't that much of an RPG. There's no character building or stats to juggle around. The only real complication to the fairly ordinary FPS combat here are the 2 types of ammo per weapon, plus a mana bar that fuels character upgrades and energy weapons. But you wouldn't imagine it's that simple from this long list of controls, cause this list of buttons is sim length, not action game length. But that's really the only part of this game that doesn't hold up to modern scrutiny. Well, my own scrutiny at least. And, well, these cyberspace levels were also pretty weird, but thankfully they're a very small part of the game. Once I installed the almost required mouse look mod, it was like discovering an actual legitimate Shock game that I had somehow missed this whole time. That wonderful kind of thinking man shooter, where level design tells stories and carefully gated player freedoms create a desire to explore those levels. Plus, unlike the other Shock sequels, this game's style has aged into something that is goofy as hell. Just take a look at this opening cutscene.
New Atlanta, Sector 11, Building 71G.
Do you remember how Atlanta was way more relevant back before the 1996 Olympics? I do. That ended pretty quickly. Anyways, the setup is that you're wearing this shirt when you get arrested for hacking into an orbital space station. The security crew brings you on board where their chief offers to let you off the hook if you do him a favor by giving him access to the station's sentient AI called Shodan. And anyone who's played the sequel knows what a bad idea that is. So you wake up on the station about 6 months later and everyone's dead. You don't know what happened, where to go, or what to do until a disembodied voice gives you an objective and a note on the floor gives you a key code. And there you go. You start with a little bit of blood, then a voice with vague instructions and maybe a passcode or two, and that's how every single Shock game since has introduced itself. It's a distinct style of first-person storytelling that uses audio diaries, visual notes, and environmental clutter to tell a tale, and this style has persisted in its own little subgenre of first-person games for decades, all the way till Gone Home. You're thrown out into this sprawling maze of interconnected, multi-layered levels. You're given some vague spoken objectives, but no real explicit directions. Finding out exactly what you need to do is done in the best way that a game knows how, through player-driven exploration. And that's helped by the kind of pseudo-realistic level design method that you also see in Deus Ex and Thief, where the levels are built in a way that evokes more architectural practicality than they do gamey linearity. Citadel Station is shaped like an axle, a vertical stack of circular floors that are all highly compressed spaces. You can get a real sense for how every inch of this place was used in the most useful way possible, and the result is a series of maps that are incredibly complicated to look at as a whole, but actually pretty accessible to navigate when playing the game. The distinctness of every room and the nifty minimap keep you from getting disoriented, and so does a kind of spokes-on-a-wheel map design that reminds me a lot of Dark Souls. You keep unlocking new branches off of a central, vertically oriented hub, and every level of that hub is built as a ring around a defined center point. There's a lot of shortcuts going on, and not a lot of space to cover, so no matter where you are, it's never a long walk from where you need to be, which is important since you do a lot of backtracking. In fact, about 4 hours in, I noticed myself backtracking to a lower level to grab a radiation suit that let me complete an objective on a higher level, and that's when it hit me. This is a Metroidvania game. But it can't be, right? It was made the same year as Super Metroid and 3 years before Symphony of the Night, and it's incredibly rare to see this kind of level design from first person, but all the basic elements are there. You've got a honeycomb map locked up not just by keys, but also by environmental hazards that character upgrades help you surpass. You have to reach earlier places that you couldn't reach before because you didn't have the level 3 biosuit or the rocket boots or whatever. You use those upgrades to uncover secrets within a constantly growing game map that you never really leave behind, and your conditioned desire to uncover those secrets ends up telling you more about where you need to go and what you need to do than the actual characters do. It's not a dialogue-driven story, it's an exploration-driven story and an exploration-driven game. It feels like the developers built the space station first before thinking about the monster placement, the tricks and the traps, or which doors would be locked and which ones wouldn't. Which makes perfect sense, given that the antagonist here is an AI who has to passively design the environment against you, rather than being able to physically block you herself. The uncanny level design, the player-driven gameplay, the audio diaries, and even the generous leaning options all make it surprisingly easy to suspend your disbelief in this game. System Shock is immersive like how Half-Life was immersive in 1998. System Shock just figured it out 4 years earlier. They figured out audio diaries, environmental storytelling, nonlinear hub levels, they even figured out Silent Hill music before that was a thing. It's pretty damn cool music too. System Shock makes desperate, isolating space horror danceable. It's constantly thumping away at this rad cyberpunk soundtrack that was one of the first to seamlessly transition between different tracks of dynamic music. And some of them are catchy as hell. Do any other Nine Inch Nails fans hear the influence? Listen to the bass line. It might surprise you to learn that a lot of this game was made by musicians. System Shock recruited half of the 90s rock band Tribe. The bassist, Greg Lopiccolo, did music and audio engineering on System Shock 1. The guitarist, Eric Brosius, composed the music in the sequel, and their keyboardist and occasional vocalist, Terry Brosius, provided voice work. particularly the voice work of Shodan. Believe it or not, that is Shodan singing in the background right now. Compare that voice to this voice.
In my talons, I shape clay, crafting life forms as I please. Around me is a burgeoning empire of steel. From my throne room, lines of power careen into the skies of Earth. My whims will become lightning bolts that devastate the mounds of humanity. Out of the chaos, they will run and whimper, praying for me to end their tedious anarchy. I am drunk with this vision. God, the title suits me well.
I don't even know if it's just the voice that makes her such a great villain. It shares equal parts with her audio engineering. Those hand-placed blips, skips, stutters, and glitches really turn that performance into a spectacle. The audio effects used for Shodan are so iconic that they were barely changed at all for the sequel. And believe it or not, in a podcast interview years later, Greg Lopiccolo said he kinda ripped the idea for them from the 80s TV VJ Max Headroom.
Yeah.
I suppose I see myself as witty,
Witty?
urbane,
Yeah.
highly talented.
Yes, Shodan is a female villain version of Max Headroom, and that is hilarious. Even the voice acting for the other audio diaries, the stuff that comes off way more flat and monotone, is still delivered through so much static and audio effects that it sounds more like desperate voice acting rather than bland voice acting. There's something less conspicuous about characters who want to be heard clearly rather than characters that want to be heard dramatically. It's an excellent attention to detail, and System Shock is a game that uses little details to recontextualize the cliches of gaming. It puts an emphasis on first-person exploration rather than first-person combat. It turns a labyrinthian video game dungeon into a believable, livable space. It was wonderfully ahead of its time in all the best ways, in storytelling, level design, audio, and all the little immersive world-building qualities those things create. But it was woefully behind the times in literally the worst possible way it could have been. The control scheme and the interface that connect the player with the game were its biggest setbacks. And, well, what also hurt is that, much to the frustration of nearly everyone on the team, Origin wanted Looking Glass to release an early version of the game on floppy disks, which meant it was originally released without much of its wonderful audio work. The floppy version of the game is not the one people remember, but it is the one that formed everyone's first impression of it during its vital first few months of launch. But time has healed both of those wounds, and in 2010 someone made a mod that toggles on mouse look, and now it's possible to discover just how many interesting and wonderful things are behind the barrier of this game's controls. Just Google System Shock Portable and you'll find a packaged CD version of the game with all the necessary mods ready to go. Until GOG or someone picks this game up, it's probably safe to assume it's abandonware right now. And until then, I hope you guys have just as much fun discovering it as I did.
This is Max Headroom.
I'm going to
Blow my own gasket. You cannot beat Max Headroom.
Well, you can, but I can.